The Awesome Adventures of Captain Spirit is a game billed as a quaint return to our childhood, its trailer packed with whimsical imagery. For me, it was a return to my youth, but a vastly different one. This charming title does a wonderful job of misdirecting players at distinct points throughout the story, always hinting at supernatural powers or magic behind the scenes. In signature Life is Strange fashion, it walks a tightrope between the mundane and the magical. Its misdirection failed me, however. I saw all too many familiar things. This installment in the Life is Strange universe begins in much the same way as its predecessors. We're treated to scenic views of the game's rural setting, followed by intimate shots of Chris's room. We're allowed to linger for just a moment, folksy music serving as the backdrop for a pleasant romp around the room. Chris has decorated his space with hastily drawn pictures of superheroes and villains, his toys strewn about, free for players to interact with. The scene being set for players is one of peace, serenity, and innocence. Chris's father, Charles, calls him over for breakfast, but the toys are much too enticing. A room full of clickables to interact with is much too distracting. His father calls Chris for breakfast again. I notice a gaming console, a play box as it's called in the game, and chuckle. His father calls Chris for the third time. His tone is not the same as the first time he called, and as Chris emerges from his room, there's a noticeable discoloration on his arm. In fact, once I saw it, it was all I could notice. Charles's tone changes back almost too quickly, reverting to that of the carefree, joking father, a role that we've seen in Life is Strange before the storm. His funny banter and quick wit are meant to distract the player, and yet the subtleties are all still noticeable. The empty beer cans littering the kitchen, the sparse house that hasn't been properly cleaned in months. Chris makes his way to the kitchen table. He continues to chastise his son, claiming he has other things to do aside from feeding his child. And as if it was never said, Charles reverts to self-deprecating jokes about his scrambled eggs. In this somewhat strained interaction, the bruises on Chris's arm become the topic of conversation. It's never explicitly stated, but it's implied that Charles is at fault. After breakfast, Charles makes his way to the living room, alcohol in hand, to watch a basketball game. The player is free to explore the humble home and complete a few tasks drawn on a list that Chris keeps with him. It's here where the game itself opens up quite a bit. Players can choose whether or not they want to clean up around the house, explore the snow-covered backyard, or assemble Chris's supersuit from mundane household items, a suit that you'll need to venture into the dreaded boiler room to confront the hot water eater, as Chris calls it, when the pilot light has gone out. As you comb through this home that carries all the realistic lived-in detail we've come to expect from a Life is Strange title, you begin to piece together a tragic story. Charles Erickson was once a prolific college basketball player with a bright future. He met and fell in love with Chris's mother, a Blackwell Academy alum and a lover of art and cinema. As you dig deeper, you realize that she has since passed, the victim of a fatal car crash. It's obvious that both father and son miss her deeply, as you regularly come across her belongings. Charles even fields a few questions about his late spouse, which invite sweet moments of reminiscence. Piecing together the broken remnants of the family's past, you can see that Charles Erickson is a single father dealing with the harsh realities of life after losing a spouse. But one must also be careful not to romanticize him as the tragic widower. When perusing through Charles's room, we find a letter from a girlfriend in his not-so-distant past, and one of the reasons that she cites for leaving him is verbal abuse, something that we get to see in action as well. While digging through Charles's desk, you also find a letter from Chris's grandparents offering to take him off Charles's hands as he deals with the recent loss of his wife, as well as some financial troubles. As someone who's experienced a vastly similar toxic relationship, I believe that for some it's easy to see Charles as a tragic figure worthy of the lion's share of their pity because at times he can be funny, charming even. But that's one of the scariest parts about abusers. They can be just as witty and charming as anyone else, smiling before snarling. He laughs with his son, even plays with him, indulging in pretend games filled with superheroes and villains, but in an instant, he can also mistreat his son, as evidenced by the bruises on his arm. Abuse doesn't always look the same. At times, there are gradients to it. A pattern emerges in these interactions between our main characters, one of take and give. Charles will insult his son or berate him in a manner that's unfitting to his son's behavior, only to quickly revert to jokes. Subtle language plays a large role in this sense, as Charles frames their actual familiar issues in fantastic language, relating himself and his son to a superhero duo at times. And while at first blush this seems like a method to make Chris more easily understand the adult issues affecting his life, it seems more manipulative as time goes on, especially when the emotional abuse crescendos to a heartbreaking scene near the end of the game. The awesome adventures of Captain Spirit elicited visceral reactions from me as the player. Not only did I cringe as I pieced together the situation, but it also brought me back to my own childhood. I was suddenly a kid again. I noticed that as less pleasant sides of Charles emerged, my gameplay suddenly changed. I responded with dialogue choices that I thought would be least confrontational. I made an effort to do things as menial as turning off lights as I bustled around the house completing chores, careful to get Chris into as little trouble as I possibly could. While Chris mills about the house, you can hear his father screaming drunken obscenities at the television. I found myself hoping that no misdirected anger would befall Chris. What began minutes ago as fun and lighthearted now felt like walking on eggshells. Earlier that morning, Charles had promised Chris that he would take him on a shopping trip for a Christmas tree, the biggest pine tree on the lot. As you subtly remind Chris of his promise, asking him just when this trip will take place, he's dismissive, but the more you prod, he becomes angrier. As I stood in the living room watching Charles day drinking, I thought only one thing, as I had seen this all before. He isn't taking you tree shopping, Chris. He's getting too drunk to take you. As the game goes on, it becomes apparent that the awesome adventures of Captain Spirit is not meant to be wholesome or childlike as a simple gimmick or a new theme to set it apart from its predecessors. These games of pretend signify something much deeper, a coping mechanism. In moments where life becomes too heavy, Chris distracts himself with fantasy. For without it, he would just be a boy, caring for a father who can't take care of himself, cleaning up musty beer cans and washing dishes with cold water. He wouldn't be fighting some fantastical creature called the Water Eater. He would be turning on a hot water heater that his father is either too drunk or depressed to turn on himself. It would all be too much. And so mechanics such as allowing players to interact with Chris's toys, to indulge his pretend superpowers at distinct moments, becomes so much more. Life is Strange always billed itself as a game where choices matter, but we were only ever given the reins when making life-changing decisions. These smaller, much more granular choices allow us to change the way we interact with the in-game world, delivering a much deeper emotional experience. Even dialogue turned from something almost arbitrary to a matter of protecting our protagonist, turning it into a careful chess match, a minefield. The awesome adventures of Captain Spirit improves upon the games that came before it from a graphical perspective as well as a narrative one. DONTNOD's method of storytelling and world-building through exploration and interaction has greatly improved as well, delivering enjoyable moment-to-moment gameplay, which mitigates the pacing issues of games past. For those with similar childhoods, this game can be difficult at moments, but it's ultimately an experience that is definitely worth having. While the narrative can be emotionally trying, the final twist at the end offers a ray of hope, and while it may not be a complete resolution to Chris's problems, it opens him up to a whole new world of possibilities. And as that young boy washing dishes in the sink with cold water and cleaning up old beer bottles, that's all I remember wishing for.